Elias Murrow pulled his collar tight against the chill as he made his way through the moor, shrouded in fog. In his hand, he clutched a letter, black, sealed with a strange insignia of an ouroboros, the ancient symbol of a snake devouring its own tail. The invitation was brief and cryptic, signed by a man he'd never met, Lord Evelyn Volk, promising truths forbidden to mortals and a portal to eternity. For Elias, the letter had arrived at the lowest point of his life. He'd once been an investigative journalist, meticulous and respected. But since the death of his wife, he'd drifted, hollow and numb. She had been his compass, and without her, he was lost. Now, this letter, hinting at the impossible, had stirred something in him. Against all reason, he felt himself drawn to this mansion and its mysteries, driven by questions he'd once dismissed. As he passed through the creaking iron gates, the chill deepened, a hushed weight settling over him as if he were stepping into a forgotten mausoleum rather than a mansion. The grand hall yawned before him, an expanse of shadow and echoing stone, lit only by dim chandeliers, casting narrow pools of light. His footsteps felt swallowed by the darkness, the air around him thick and watchful. The iron gates creaked open as he approached, the heavy silence thickening around him. He entered the grand hall, an expanse of shadow and echoing stone, lit only by dim chandeliers casting narrow pools of light. His footsteps felt swallowed by the darkness, the air around him thick and watchful. A tall, thin figure appeared, a man with hollow cheeks and dark eyes that seemed to weigh him in a single glance. "Lord Volk awaits you," the man said softly, his tone almost reverent. Elias followed him down winding corridors lined with antique relics and forgotten tomes, the air colder and heavier the deeper they went. Finally, they stopped before a pair of carved wooden doors marked with strange, interlocking symbols that seemed to move in the candlelight. Inside, the room was lit by flickering candelabras, their light barely touching the high, vaulted ceiling. And there, dominating the center, stood the Obsidian Mirror, its polished black surface drinking in all the light, reflecting only shadows. Lord Volk waited beside it, tall and austere, with a presence that was both refined and menacing. His gaze was piercing, searching Elias's face as though he knew more about him than Elias did himself. "Welcome, Mr. Murrow," Volk said with a slight enigmatic smile. "The journey was not too difficult, I hope." Elias forced a nod. "I wasn't sure I'd come at first, but your letter left me no choice." "I hoped it would," Volk replied, gesturing toward the mirror. "Few have the curiosity and courage to seek what lies beyond." Elias's eyes lingered on the mirror's dark surface, feeling an unsettling pull. "What is this, really?" he asked, fighting to keep his voice steady. Volk's smile deepened, his gaze unwavering. "A reflection of what lies within," he replied, his voice low, almost a whisper. "A portal of sorts, but its true nature, well, that is something you must see for yourself." Elias looked back at the mirror, feeling its dark allure and the faint sense of something watching him from its depths. It was both beautiful and terrifying, and he felt an irrational urge to step closer, to see what it might reveal. Volk's hand fell gently on his shoulder, a touch that was both comforting and ominous. "There is no need to rush. In time, all things are revealed," he said, his tone carrying a weight Elias could not yet understand. The question hung in the air, unspoken, as Elias felt himself drawn deeper into the mysteries of Malvern Hall, where shadows whispered and walls watched, waiting to see if he would dare to seek the truth, or fall into the darkness it concealed. The hallways of Malvern Hall stretched like dark veins through the mansion, winding and narrow, with dim sconces casting thin ribbons of light along the cold stone. Elias followed Lord Volk through the silent corridors, the faint echoes of their footsteps absorbed by walls that seemed to close in as they walked. Elias felt a chill settle over him, his initial curiosity twisting into apprehension. This place felt ancient, untouched by time, preserved in shadows and silence. Malvern Hall was no ordinary estate. It was a relic, steeped in secrets, and each step forward felt like descending into a labyrinth he might never leave. They stopped before a set of massive double doors, etched with strange symbols that twisted and looped in intricate patterns, pulling at the edges of Elias's vision, making his eyes ache if he looked too long. Before he could study them further, Volk pushed the doors open, revealing the chamber within. The room was large but dimly lit, its walls lined with candelabras casting shadows that danced across the stone, their flickering flames revealing just enough to hint at the room's scale. And there, standing at the center, was the Obsidian Mirror. Elias felt its pull immediately, as if a magnetic force had taken hold of him, drawing him closer despite a building unease. The mirror loomed, its surface a polished void, absorbing light until only shadows were reflected. It felt alive, watching him, sizing him up. He took an involuntary step forward, almost mesmerized, until Volk's voice, low and steady, broke through the silence, grounding him. Lord Volk stood beside the mirror, his gaze intense, his presence commanding. "This mirror is more than glass and stone, Mr. Murrow," he said, his voice low. "It shows us what we bury, what we fear, or perhaps what we desire most deeply." He paused, a glint of something dark flickering in his eyes. "But it only reveals to those willing to look." Elias felt the weight of Volk's words settle over him like a shadow. "And what exactly does it show us?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Volk's expression softened into a faint smile, but it held no warmth. "What lies within you, Mr. Murrow? Nothing more, nothing less." The mirror's silent pull deepened, as if hearing his unspoken thoughts and drawing him nearer. He felt the memory stirring, of a voice he knew well, laughter that had once filled the spaces around him, a hand that had warmed his own. His wife. The grief was a constant presence, a silent ache he carried. But here, in the presence of this mirror, that grief was something else. A promise, almost tangible, like an invitation waiting to be accepted. Could the mirror truly bring her back to him? Elias found himself stepping closer, his breath slowing as he focused on the mirror's depths. It had been years since she'd passed, yet the image of her remained as vivid as the day she left him, frozen in memory. He could see her smile as clearly as if she were in the room, her warmth and light pulling him in. His grip on the present slipped, and he found himself wondering if this mirror could somehow bridge the chasm between him and his loss. The mirror's dark surface seemed to ripple, shadows within shifting as if responding to his silent longing. He felt the question rise within him, an unbidden desire. What would you give to see her again? His pulse quickened, an involuntary thrill mixing with his fear as he considered what that might mean if this mirror truly held such a possibility. Volk's voice brought him back, drifting through the room with a calm resonance. "Each of you will look in turn. The mirror reveals something different to everyone. What you see depends on what lies within." Elias glanced over his shoulder at the others, Dr. Margaux, with her sharp, skeptical gaze, and Caleb, whose haunted expression mirrored Elias's own. They had come for different reasons, yet Elias sensed they were all bound here by something deeper, something none of them fully understood. Taking a steadying breath, Elias stepped forward, his heart racing as he looked into the mirror's black depths. At first, he saw only his own reflection, hazy and shadowed. But as he continued to gaze, the image began to shift, the dark surface seeming to ripple, the shapes within twisting and reforming. Slowly, he saw her, his wife standing beside him, her laughter filling the air, her hand warm in his. It was a memory, one he'd held on to in the darkest nights since her death. But here it felt almost tangible. Her smile was soft, her eyes bright, and for a moment Elias felt as if he were whole again. Then, in an instant, her face changed. Her eyes widened in terror, her mouth opening in a silent scream as she reached for him, her expression twisted with agony. Elias staggered back, the vision shattering, leaving only his own haunted reflection staring back. His chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath, the pain of seeing her, alive, then lost again, cutting deeper than he'd anticipated. Lord Volk's voice drifted through the haze, calm and penetrating. "The mirror reveals truths we may not be ready to face, Mr. Murrow." Elias's hands trembled as he took a step back, his mind reeling. He hadn't expected the mirror to touch something so deeply buried, to pry open a wound he'd thought hidden. He glanced at Volk, seeking understanding, but Volk's expression remained unreadable, his gaze fixed on the mirror as though it held secrets even he could not fully fathom. Dr. Margaux stepped forward next, her gaze steady, her steps measured. She was known for her logical mind, her disciplined skepticism, yet as she looked into the mirror, Elias noticed a flicker of vulnerability, a faint widening of her eyes. At first, her reflection seemed to be just that, her own face, composed and self-assured. But then, slowly, the image began to shift. She saw herself transformed, clad in black, her face shadowed, her eyes intense, holding a knowledge that bordered on malevolence. Her reflection's lips curled into a slight smile, a look of triumph that seemed to mock her, as if daring her to embrace this version of herself. Margaux's gaze stayed locked on the image, her mouth parting slightly as though in reverence. Her reflection leaned closer, its voice a faint whisper that only she seemed to hear. "You could be so much more," it murmured. "All you have to do is let go." Elias saw Margaux's hand twitch, a momentary hesitation, as though tempted to reach out. But her face tightened, a flicker of control surfacing, and she stepped back. Her expression strained, her gaze shuttered. "It's compelling," she murmured, her voice taut, "though it seems designed to deceive us." Volk's gaze flickered with amusement. "The mirror reveals what lies within, Dr. Margaux. Whether you see it as deception or revelation is entirely up to you." Caleb approached last, his face pale, eyes wide with anticipation, and something darker. He had always seemed burdened, haunted, but as he looked into the mirror, his sorrow deepened, swallowing him whole. Elias watched as Caleb's reflection shifted, the vision within the glass changing almost instantly. Caleb saw his younger brother, lost years ago in a tragic accident. His brother's face stared back from the mirror, his eyes filled with fear, his mouth open in a silent scream. Caleb's hand trembled as he reached for the mirror, his face contorting with grief and guilt. The memory of his brother's death hung between them like a dark cloud, a weight Caleb had never been able to shake. "Caleb," Elias called gently, but Caleb didn't respond, his gaze locked on the image, his hand pressed against the glass. Volk's voice broke the silence, cool and steady. "The mirror shows us what we seek and what we fear. It does not give without taking, nor reveal without consequence." Caleb's face twisted and his hand dropped as he took a shaky step back, his body tense, his eyes hollow. Elias could see the pain and longing etched into his friend's features, a sorrow that was only deepening. Volk's gaze moved between them, his expression unreadable, though there was a glint of satisfaction in his eyes. "The mirror has shown you its power," he said softly. "It reveals what lies within, to those willing to confront it." Elias felt a strange bond between them as they left the room, a sense of shared isolation. They were all prisoners here, bound not by walls, but by the mirror's pull, by the secrets it had unearthed. As they walked back down the hall, Elias glanced at Margaux and Caleb, noting how they seemed altered, their gazes distant, their steps unsteady, as though the mirror had planted seeds that were already beginning to grow. And as he followed them down the dim corridor, a question lingered in his mind, like a dark promise echoing through the silence. What price was he willing to pay for the truth? Days blurred together within the dim corridors of Malvern Hall, each hour growing heavier, the air thick with a creeping dread. Elias noticed disconcerting details, the hallways seeming to shift, the cold pressing against his skin with each step. After each visit to the mirror room, a chill settled into his bones that refused to fade, lingering like a silent reminder of the mirror's influence. Malvern Hall felt alive, its rooms narrowing, the walls seeming to lean closer, guiding him deeper into its labyrinthine shadows. His nights were haunted by fractured dreams of his wife's face. Sometimes she was vibrant and laughing, but then her expression would twist into one of terror, her eyes wide with an unspoken warning. He'd wake gasping, his heart pounding, clutching the sheets as though they could anchor him. The dread stayed with him, burrowing under his skin, whispering that he was already beginning to lose himself. One afternoon, Elias drifted through the shadowed halls, each corner holding its own sense of watching silence, as if the mansion were breathing in unison with his steps. Shadows rippled in the flickering candlelight, the weight of an unseen presence closing around him. He was about to turn away when he noticed the door to the mirror room, left slightly ajar. A faint glow seeped through the gap, and he paused, his breath hitching as a sense of foreboding pull beckoned him to step inside. He pushed the door open quietly, peering into the dimly lit room. There, standing alone before the mirror, was Dr. Margaux. She hadn't noticed him, her attention entirely focused on her reflection. She stood utterly still, her eyes wide, almost reverent, her hand hovering inches from the glass, her fingers curling slightly as if drawn to touch it. Her lips moved in a faint murmur, her voice too soft to hear, and he realized with a chill that she was speaking to herself, or rather to her reflection. Elias watched her for a moment, uneasy. There was a look in her eyes he hadn't seen before, a hunger, sharp and intense, like a spark kindled into something darker. The cool, skeptical Margaux he'd come to know seemed to vanish, replaced by someone captivated, even enthralled. It was as though the mirror had opened a door within her, revealing a part of herself she had kept hidden. He cleared his throat softly, and she startled, snapping her hand back, her gaze flickering to the floor as if caught in an act she couldn't explain. "Oh, Elias," she murmured, her voice unsteady. She quickly composed herself, her expression shifting back to its usual guarded skepticism. "I was just reflecting," she said with a faint, strained smile. Elias forced a nod, masking his unease. "The mirror has that effect, doesn't it?" Margaux's eyes lingered on the mirror for a moment longer before she turned away, her posture rigid. "It's unlike anything I've encountered," she admitted, her tone reluctant but tinged with something else, something almost worshipful. "I thought I came here to understand, to observe, but it's as if the mirror is showing me parts of myself I'd never dared to explore." Her gaze flicked back to the mirror, and for an instant her expression softened, her eyes almost tender. Elias felt a pang of unease as he watched her. He'd always respected Margaux's sharp intellect, her fierce independence, but now, as he saw the way the mirror's influence seemed to draw her in, he wondered if even she might be vulnerable to its pull. "Margaux, don't you feel it?" he asked, his voice low. "It's twisting everything, feeding on us." Margaux's gaze sharpened, her eyes narrowing. "And maybe that's exactly what makes it so valuable," she replied, her tone firm. "It reflects not just what we are, but what we could be. Isn't that worth exploring?" Elias searched her face, troubled. "Just be careful," he said softly, feeling a strange urge to protect her, even if she couldn't see the threat. "Sometimes the cost of exploring can be too high." Her expression hardened slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. I don't need your warnings, Elias. I'm capable of understanding the risks. She glanced back at the mirror, her eyes distant, her fingers twitching as though resisting the urge to reach out again. Elias left the room, a lingering sense of unease gnawing at him. It was becoming clear that the mirror was not just an object of fascination for Margaux. It was a source of obsession, a doorway she seemed unable to resist. He wondered how far she might go, what she might be willing to sacrifice in her pursuit of the truth the mirror promised. That night, as he roamed the halls in an attempt to shake off the day's unsettling encounters, Elias caught sight of Margaux again. She was standing near a narrow window at the end of the corridor, her silhouette stark against the faint moonlight filtering through the mist. She seemed lost in thought, her gaze distant, her hands clenched tightly at her sides. Her face held an intensity he couldn't quite place, a mixture of longing and determination that sent a chill down his spine. Elias approached slowly, his footsteps quiet against the cold stone. She didn't turn, her focus fixed somewhere beyond the walls, as though searching for something just out of reach. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she murmured, her voice soft, almost wistful. He stopped beside her, looking out at the dark moor stretching into the night. "What is?" "The reflection," she replied, her gaze shifting slightly, her eyes catching the faint light with an unsettling gleam. "It holds so much potential. It shows us who we really are, without the masks, without the pretenses. Don't you feel it?" Elias felt a pang of apprehension as he looked at her, the intensity in her gaze almost frightening. "Margaux, are you sure this is what you want? The mirror. It doesn't just show us. It changes us." She looked at him, her expression unreadable, her eyes dark and knowing. "Perhaps change is exactly what we need," she said softly, her voice carrying a strange, almost reverent edge. He couldn't find the words to respond, his mind struggling to process the shift he sensed in her. She had always been the voice of reason, the one who questioned everything, yet now she seemed more willing than ever to surrender to the mirror's promises. As he watched her turn and walk away, a sense of foreboding settled over him, the weight of it pressing down like a silent warning. In the days that followed, Elias became more aware of Margaux's growing attachment to the mirror. He would often find her lingering near it, her fingers brushing the air just above its surface, her gaze locked onto her reflection with a look of fascination that bordered on reverence. Her demeanor had changed, her skepticism softened, her expression almost dreamlike whenever she looked into the glass. One evening, he overheard her speaking softly to herself, her voice filled with a quiet intensity that sent a chill through him. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a tone of longing, of hope, as if the mirror held the answers to questions she had never voiced. Elias couldn't shake the feeling that the mirror was slowly consuming her, feeding on her curiosity and her ambition, twisting them into something darker. He tried to approach her, to pull her back, but each time she brushed him off, her focus unwavering, her fascination growing. As the days stretched on, Elias began to see Margaux less as a colleague and more as a stranger, someone ensnared by forces he could barely comprehend. He wanted to help her, to protect her from the mirror's influence, but he feared that it might already be too late, that she was already too far gone, her soul entwined with the mirror's dark promises. And as he watched her, he felt a chilling realization settle over him. Margaux wasn't just intrigued by the mirror. She was willing to give herself over to it, to sacrifice everything for the truth it promised, no matter the cost. The days grew colder within Malvern Hall, a creeping chill that seemed to emanate from the mirror room and permeate every corner of the mansion. Shadows stretched along the walls, lengthening in the dim corridors as though alive and pressing in closer. As Elias moved through the mansion, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the house itself had become an entity waiting to ensnare him. Late one night, Elias noticed a flickering light in the library. The faint glow drew him in, the comforting scent of old parchment filling the room as he pushed the door open to find Caleb, hunched over a large ancient tome. Caleb's fingers traced the faded symbols on the brittle pages, his face illuminated only by the glow of a single candle. His shoulders were tense, his gaze intent, almost feverish. "Caleb?" Elias called softly, trying not to startle him. Caleb's head snapped up, his wide eyes brimming with a mixture of frustration and desperation. "It's here, Elias," he said, voice hoarse. "I know it. There's a way to reach him. A way to bring him back." His voice was barely above a whisper, as though speaking it aloud might shatter the fragile hope he clung to. Elias took a step closer, his gaze falling on the symbols Caleb had been studying. They looked eerily familiar, the same looping patterns he'd seen flickering within the mirror's depths, shapes that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The sight sent a shiver through him. "Caleb, what are you talking about?" Elias asked, his tone gentle, concerned. "Who are you trying to reach?" Caleb hesitated, his face tightening, a shadow crossing his features. He swallowed, his eyes darting back to the tome as though it held answers he couldn't bear to let go of. "My brother," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper. "He was young. Just a boy, really. There was an accident. We were on a trail near the cliffs, and he—" Caleb's voice faltered, a haunted look filling his eyes. "He slipped. I saw him go over the edge. I tried to reach him, but I was too late." A thick silence settled between them, the weight of Caleb's confession hanging in the air. Elias watched him, feeling a pang of sympathy, the kind of pain only a loved one's absence could create. Caleb clenched his fists, his knuckles white, his gaze fixed on the symbols before him. "The mirror," Caleb continued, his voice shaking, his eyes intense. "It shows him, Elias. Just before he slipped. Every time I look into it, I see him. It's like he's trapped there, caught in that final moment, waiting for me to reach him. If there's even a chance I can undo it, bring him back, I have to try." Elias felt a chill run down his spine as he listened, the desperation in Caleb's voice unmistakable. It was the kind of desperation that could drive a man to places he'd never go otherwise, that could make him abandon reason, even his own safety. The mirror wasn't just a mystery to Caleb, it was a promise, however twisted, of redemption. "Caleb, it doesn't just show us things. Elias said cautiously, choosing his words with care. It's feeding on us, taking something each time we look. Caleb's face contorted, a flash of anger mingling with the pain in his eyes. You don't understand, Elias, he said, his voice tight. I can't just let it go. I can't just live with it. If the mirror shows him, if it gives me away, then I have to try. His hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the book, his voice thick with barely suppressed emotion. Elias felt a sense of foreboding as he watched Caleb, realizing how fully the mirror had ensnared him. Caleb wasn't just interested in the mirror, he was bound to it, consumed by the need to reach his brother, to rewrite the past he couldn't let go of. It was as though the mirror had sensed that longing, using it as bait to lure him deeper. The following morning, they gathered for breakfast in the dining hall. Though the atmosphere was thick with silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts, weighed down by the mirror's influence. Lord Volk joined them, his presence calm yet watchful, his eyes lingering on each of them as though appraising their willingness, their vulnerabilities. Volk raised his glass in a quiet toast, his gaze drifting over Caleb with an almost knowing look. To revelation, he said, his voice low, each word carrying a strange resonance. May the mirror show you the truth you seek. Elias felt his stomach twist, the weight of Volk's words unsettling him. He glanced at Caleb, who clutched his glass tightly, his expression strained, as though clinging to some hidden resolve. The promise in Volk's words seemed to fuel Caleb's desperation, stoking the fire that had already begun consuming him. As the meal ended, Elias noticed Caleb's fixed stare, his fingers trembling as he gripped his empty glass. Elias lingered, catching Caleb's arm as they made their way out of the dining hall. In the dim corridor, away from Volk's watchful eyes, Elias leaned close. Caleb, he murmured, his voice barely audible, a plea thickening in his throat. Are you sure about this? I don't trust Volk. I don't trust the mirror. Whatever it's showing you, it's twisting things. It's not a way forward. Caleb looked at him, his gaze hard and unwavering. I know what I saw, Elias. I know what the mirror is showing me, and if there's even a chance, I have to take it. He pulled away, his steps purposeful as he left the hall, leaving Elias standing alone, a growing sense of dread coiling within him. As the days stretched on, Elias found himself catching glimpses of Caleb in the mirror room at odd hours, his posture tense, his face drawn as he stared into the glass, searching for something only he could see. Sometimes Elias would find him muttering softly to himself, his words too faint to hear, his expression one of both hope and despair. One night Elias entered the library again, only to find Caleb hunched over a different tome, tracing more symbols with a frantic urgency. Shadows pooled around him, flickering in the dim light, casting strange shapes across his face that made him look almost haunted. Caleb, Elias began, but his friend didn't look up. The symbols, they're part of a ritual, Caleb murmured, his voice tight. Something that could open a path. I think it's connected to the mirror, to what it shows us. I've seen these shapes in the mirror, Elias. I think it's a way to cross over. His eyes gleamed with a strange light, a fervor that bordered on fanaticism. Elias felt a surge of dread as he listened, realizing that Caleb was already too deep, that the mirror's promises had taken root within him. He couldn't shake the image of Caleb's haunted gaze, his hand tracing the same symbol over and over. A looping pattern that almost seemed to echo the ouroboros, the serpent consuming itself, a cycle that would never end. "Caleb, please," Elias said, his voice rough, "think about what you're doing. The mirror, it's not giving you answers, it's using your grief, feeding on it. You're becoming part of whatever trap it's laid for all of us." Caleb's face twisted, a mixture of anger and sorrow filling his eyes. "You think I don't know that?" he whispered, his voice shaking. "You think I don't see the trap? But if I have even the smallest chance to save him, to bring him back, I can't just turn away." His gaze drifted back to the tome, his fingers tracing the symbols again, his expression hardening. Elias watched him in silence, feeling the painful inevitability of Caleb's choices settling over him. The mirror had taken hold of him, wrapping around his grief, his guilt, binding him to its promises with a grip that Elias feared was unbreakable. The mirror room had never felt colder than it did that night. Shadows twisted across the stone walls, coiling with a strange life of their own, as though they anticipated the ritual about to unfold. Elias entered slowly, his heart pounding, as he saw Margaux and Lord Volk standing near the mirror. Their expressions were unreadable, but there was a dark, expectant gleam in Volk's eyes. Volk gestured for Elias to come closer, his voice low and resonant. "I see you have finally come, Mr. Murrow. The mirror has chosen you, as it chose me once." There was a weight in his words, a tiredness that hinted at something deeply personal. Elias took a cautious step forward, glancing from Margaux to Volk. His mind raced with questions and a growing sense of dread. Volk's gaze was intent, and for the first time, Elias noticed faint lines of strain around his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability in his posture. "You think I am immune, Mr. Murrow?" Volk said softly, his tone carrying a surprising undercurrent of weariness. "I too came here seeking answers, believing I could master the mirror's power. But I was mistaken. The mirror, it does not allow mastery. It binds, it consumes, it devours." Elias felt a shiver run down his spine. The image of the ouroboros, the serpent devouring its own tail, flashed in his mind, a symbol he had seen on his invitation and etched throughout the mansion's stonework. It was an emblem of eternity, of cycles that held no beginning or end. And now he understood that it represented Volk's own fate, his endless, inescapable loop within Malvern Hall. "You're trapped here," Elias whispered, the realization settling over him. "That's why you need me, to take your place." Volk's eyes met his, a glimmer of regret in his gaze. "The mirror's price is steep. It demands a willing soul, someone who surrenders freely. When I first looked into its depths, I saw visions of eternity, of power beyond comprehension. I was seduced by what it promised, and now I am bound to it, no more than a shadow within its grasp." He paused, his gaze drifting to the mirror, the dark surface reflecting only the faintest hints of movement. "I cannot leave, Elias, not until another takes my place." Elias's pulse quickened, anger simmering beneath his fear. "So, you brought us here under false pretenses. You used our grief, our desperation, to find someone to replace you." His voice shook, but his gaze was steady, holding Volk's with defiance. Volk's expression softened, and for a moment he looked almost human. almost remorseful. "It is true. I did seek you out, knowing you had the strength and the loss that would make you susceptible to the mirror's promises. But understand this, Mr. Murrow. I am as much a prisoner as anyone who has come here before you." Elias's fists clenched, his nails digging into his palms. "You've been manipulating us, twisting our pain to suit your own ends. And Margaux—" He glanced at her, searching her face for any trace of the ally he had once trusted, but she met his gaze with a cold, unyielding stare. Margaux's lips curved into a faint, almost pitying smile. "I made my choice, Elias. I see the mirror's potential, its power. Volk's motives are his own, but I understand the value of what he offers." Her gaze held a strange reverence, as though she'd already surrendered to the mirror's allure. Elias's mind reeled, feeling the weight of betrayal and desperation settle over him. He turned back to Volk, a dark, pressing question forming on his lips. "If you're trapped, if the mirror feeds on you, how many others have you led here before me? How many have you sacrificed to keep this cycle going?" Volk's face tightened, the flicker of regret returning. "Many," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Too many, each one willing, each one drawn to the mirror by their own hunger for answers, for power, or for love. The mirror is patient. It waits, knowing that someone, somewhere, will always come seeking its promises." Elias's heart pounded as he absorbed Volk's words, the depth of his manipulation sinking in. Volk was as much a victim as a villain, bound to a fate he had chosen but could not escape. And now Elias stood on the precipice of that same path. "You don't have to do this," Elias said, his voice steady but pleading. "There must be another way, some way to break this cycle without sacrificing another soul." Volk shook his head, a look of profound sadness shadowing his face. "The mirror's cycle is unbreakable, Mr. Murrow. The ouroboros is eternal, an endless loop of creation and destruction, a force that sustains itself by consuming those who dare to seek it out." He took a step closer, his gaze intent. "But know this, if you surrender willingly, you will become part of something greater, something eternal. The pain, the loss, they will no longer haunt you. The mirror will devour them, leaving only peace." Elias's skin prickled with horror as he listened, the words wrapping around him like a dark spell. He understood now that the mirror's promises were illusions, bait for those desperate enough to believe them. His wife's memory, the allure of reunion, none of it was real. It was only a tool, a means to lure him into the mirror's grasp. He took a step back, his resolve hardening as he looked between Volk and Margaux. "No, I won't surrender. I won't be part of this endless loop." Margaux's expression darkened, her gaze turning cold. "Then you're a fool, Elias. The mirror offers power, transcendence, freedom from the suffering that binds us all. If you're too weak to accept it, then perhaps you don't deserve it." Volk's hand fell on Elias's shoulder, his grip firm yet oddly gentle. "Think carefully, Mr. Murrow. The mirror's call is eternal. You may try to escape, but it will find you again, one way or another. This is your chance to end the suffering, to embrace the peace it offers." Elias shrugged off Volk's hand, his gaze steely, resolute. "Peace. What you're offering isn't peace. It's oblivion. A fate worse than death, bound forever to the mirror's hunger." He took a final look at the dark glass, the shapes swirling within, each one a soul trapped, devoured, lost to the cycle of the ouroboros. He turned on his heel, his heart pounding as he strode toward the exit, his mind racing with the weight of his decision. He wouldn't surrender to the mirror, wouldn't allow himself to be consumed. He would fight, even if it meant facing the mirror's eternal pull. As he left the chamber, Volk's voice echoed after him, calm and filled with certainty. "You may leave, Elias, but remember, the ouroboros has no end. You cannot run from eternity." The words lingered in his mind, a haunting reminder of the mirror's hold, its endless, inescapable loop. But he pushed them aside, determined to find a way out, to break free from the fate Volk had resigned himself to. Elias knew, deep down, that the mirror's influence might always follow him, But as he left Malvern Hall's dark heart, he clung to a single unyielding thought. He would not become another soul trapped within its endless cycle. Elias's footsteps echoed through the silent corridors, each step weighted by a mounting sense of dread. The walls of Malvern Hall seemed closer, tighter, as if the mansion itself were conspiring to trap him. The shadows twisted and curled, casting looping patterns that looked almost deliberate. He tried to shake the unsettling feeling that he was being watched, pursued by something unseen. His mind raced, and as he neared the main hall, the thought of fleeing crept in, filling him with a desperate hope. He could run, leave Malvern Hall behind, escape its clutches before it consumed him entirely. Yet just as he entertained the thought, an image flashed in his mind, stark and undeniable. The ouroboros, the serpent devouring itself. It was like a persistent, invasive thought, filling his mind with a sense of futility. Each time he felt the urge to flee, the symbol seemed to appear unbidden, winding through his thoughts, reminding him of the cycle he was trapped in, a cycle he might never escape. He pressed on, each step heavy with the weight of the serpent's relentless pull, knowing it represented the mirror's hold on him, a loop that promised neither freedom nor release. He finally entered the mirror room, the air thick with a chill that bit into his skin, sharper than before. Lord Volk was already there, his gaze distant, his figure casting long shadows that seemed to pulse with the room's strange energy. Volk's expression was one of calm resignation, but as he turned to look at Elias, a flicker of something deeper, something hollow and trapped, passed over his face. "I knew you would return, Elias," Volk murmured, his voice soft yet certain. "The mirror does not allow its chosen to escape so easily." Elias felt a shiver as he met Volk's gaze, the ouroboros flashing in his mind once more. It was as if the mirror had imprinted the symbol within him, binding him to its cycle, feeding his own fears and drawing him deeper into its influence. He looked at Volk, unable to hide the resentment and fear burning in his chest. "Is that what you are, Volk? Another soul trapped by the mirror?" Elias's voice wavered, his pulse racing, as the implications of Volk's role finally settled over him. Volk's expression softened, a shadow of regret passing over his features. "We are all part of the cycle, Elias. Each of us drawn by the mirror, each of us seeking something we've lost." His gaze shifted to the mirror, his eyes darkening as he continued. "But the mirror's power is not a gift. It is a hunger, an ouroboros devouring each soul it touches." Elias clenched his fists, feeling the room's weight pressing down on him. He took a step back, his heart pounding as he struggled to contain the horror filling his mind. Every part of him screamed to run, to break free, yet the image of the ouroboros looped within him, reminding him that each step toward the exit would only bring him back to the mirror. The cycle was inescapable. The mirror would always find him, drawing him into its endless hunger. Dr. Margaux stepped into the room, her expression resolute, her gaze fixed firmly on Elias. She moved with a strange calm, her movements controlled, but Elias noticed the faintest tremor in her hands, the hint of fear behind her determination. Her betrayal was still fresh, the shock of it stinging like an open wound. "Elias, there's no escaping this," she said, her tone almost soothing, as though she were trying to ease him into the inevitable. The mirror is offering us a chance to transcend, to become part of something greater. Elias looked at her, disbelief and anger coursing through him. Transcend, he spat, his voice shaking. No, Margaux. It's consuming us. We're fuel for something. Endless. Margaux's eyes narrowed, her face twisting in frustration. That's where you're wrong, Elias. The mirror's power is eternal. It's a cycle, yes, but one that preserves us. We will live on, as part of the mirror's energy, beyond the limits of mortality. Elias felt a surge of defiance, his own sense of survival pushing back against her twisted reasoning. He took a step toward the mirror, his gaze fixed on the glass, shadows writhing within it, shifting and coiling into shapes that looked disturbingly familiar. For a fleeting moment, he saw the ouroboros reflected in the depths, the serpent's body looping endlessly, its mouth devouring its own tail. It was then that he noticed his own reflection, distorted and fragmented. Pieces of his face stretched and twisted within the loop. His own reflection was being consumed, swallowed whole by the ouroboros, his image fading into the endless cycle of souls trapped within the mirror. He stumbled back, his breath hitching, the horror of it almost too much to bear. The mirror wasn't merely a portal or a source of power, it was a vortex, a devouring force pulling everything into its cyclical hunger. Each soul became part of the ouroboros, caught in an endless loop of consumption and entrapment. Volk's voice cut through the silence, steady and cold. Do you understand now, Elias? This is your fate, your place within the cycle. The mirror's grip is eternal, and once you surrender, you will become part of its power, bound to it forever. Elias's heart pounded, fear mingling with desperation as he looked between Volk and the mirror. He saw faces within its depths, Caleb, Margaux, countless others, all trapped within the ouroboros, devoured yet somehow alive, each one an echo of their former self. No, he whispered, his voice barely audible. I won't be part of this. I won't let it consume me. But even as he spoke, he felt the mirror's pull intensify, the image of the ouroboros flashing in his mind, relentless and unyielding. It was as if the mirror were inside him, feeding on his fear, twisting his thoughts into a loop that always led back to it, to its cold, consuming hunger. Volk took a step forward, his voice soft but unbreakable. There is no other path, Elias. You are already part of the cycle. You can fight it, but it will bring you back here, again and again, until you surrender. Elias's pulse raced, the weight of Volk's words pressing down on him. He realized with a sinking dread that the ouroboros was more than a symbol. It was the mirror's essence, an embodiment of its power. And as long as he remained within its grasp, he was bound to its cycle, caught in a loop he could never escape. With a final desperate surge of strength, Elias tore his gaze from the mirror, stumbling backward. His heart pounded, his breath ragged, and he could feel the mirror's pull weakening, but only slightly. It was still there, a presence lurking in his mind, an ouroboros winding through his thoughts, waiting for him to return. As he stumbled out of the room, he could still feel its grip. A cold presence coiled around his mind, whispering promises of peace, of reunion, of everything he'd ever wanted. But he knew now what those promises meant, that they were lies spun by a force that would devour him without hesitation. Elias ran through the corridors, each step an effort to break free, yet the image of the ouroboros persisted, a reminder that the mirror's influence would always be with him. Even as he fled, he knew the mirror would remain a part of him, an unbreakable bond tying him to its endless cycle, pulling him back again and again to its cold embrace. The rain had stopped by the time Elias reached the edge of the moor, the air crisp and cold, carrying the faint scent of damp earth. He paused at the crest of a hill, casting one last glance back at the shadowed silhouette of Malvern Hall, barely visible now, shrouded in mist that lingered over the mansion's darkened spires. Malvern Hall loomed in the distance, brooding and seemingly untouched, but Elias knew better. A shift had taken place, a severing of the ancient power that had bound him to that cursed place. Lord Volk was gone, his fate sealed, and with him Margaux and Caleb, lost, claimed by the mirror, their souls captured within its unyielding depths. The mansion remained, its secrets entombed, its dark influence dormant. Yet a sense of finality clung to the moor, as though the land itself had taken a deep breath. Elias turned away, the weight of exhaustion pressing down on his shoulders. Each step along the narrow path felt heavy, his limbs aching from the strain of the journey he had just survived. But there was a strange lightness within him as well, a sense that he'd escaped the darkness, that he was no longer bound by its hold. The events of Malvern Hall were already beginning to feel distant, as though he'd emerged from a fevered dream. He reached a small village on the edge of the moor, its winding streets quiet under the muted light of dawn. People watched him with a mix of curiosity and concern as he passed, his appearance bedraggled, his expression haunted yet resolute. A woman approached him, offering directions to the inn, and he nodded in thanks, making his way to its warm, inviting shelter. Inside, the innkeeper took one look at him and nodded, leading him to a room on the upper floor. Elias sat heavily on the edge of the bed, feeling the warmth of the room begin to thaw the lingering chill in his bones. For the first time in days, he felt secure, truly removed from the oppressive shadows of Malvern Hall. He sank into a deep, dreamless sleep, enveloped by silence, no longer haunted by visions or whispers from the mirror. When he woke, sunlight streamed through the small window, casting a soft glow over the room. A tray of bread and tea had been left at his door, and he ate slowly, savoring each bite, each sip. The simplicity of the food grounded him, reminding him of the life he could return to, the life that waited beyond the fog and shadows of the moor. After a while, he moved to the window, gazing out over the moors. In the distance, Malvern Hall sat as a faint shadow on the horizon. He knew it would remain there, a dark presence, but it no longer filled him with dread. Instead, it felt like a memory, something he could finally leave behind. From his pocket, he withdrew a small cloth-wrapped object. Carefully, he unwrapped it, revealing the shard of the mirror he had taken in his haste to escape the mansion. The shard glinted in the sunlight, its surface polished and smooth, reflecting only shadows and faint ghostly images that shifted within. As he stared into it, the memories of Malvern Hall surfaced. Visions of his wife, promises that had felt so real. The temptation to surrender to the mirror's dark pull. He remembered the twisted faces he had seen within its depths, the silent screams, the eternal agony of those it had claimed. The mirror had preyed on his deepest longing, exploiting the ache that had driven him to its doorstep. He closed his eyes, a wave of understanding washing over him. He had come to the mirror seeking answers, a reunion with his lost love, some form of closure. But the mirror had shown him only shadows, promises as hollow as the darkness it concealed. It had taken him to the edge, forced him to confront the futility of clinging to a past that could never be. He realized now that his journey had not been about reclaiming the life he had lost. It had been about finding the strength to let it go. The mirror's promises, he saw now, were illusions, bait for the desperate and the grieving. In holding on to the shard, he had been holding on to that darkness, a piece of the trap that had nearly consumed him. And now, as he stared into its depths, he understood that releasing it meant releasing everything the mirror represented. His sorrow, his fear, and the memories that bound him to the past. He stepped toward the window, holding the shard over the ledge, feeling its cool weight pressing against his palm, a final temptation to keep it as a reminder. He considered it for a long moment, recognizing the pull it still held, the lure of the past whispering for him to cling to what he'd lost. But he knew now that keeping the shard meant anchoring himself to the darkness, forever tethered to a memory that could no longer serve him. He whispered softly, "Goodbye," and released the shard. It fell in silence, disappearing into the shadows below, as if swallowed by the earth. A strange lightness replaced the familiar weight in his chest, a quiet clarity settling over him. As he turned from the window, the inn around him felt warmer, more vibrant. The muted sounds of life beyond his door seemed to welcome him, a reminder of the world waiting for him to return. The act felt like a final severing, a choice to step away from the shadows, to let the past rest. By letting go of the shard, he was letting go of the darkness. It was time to walk forward, to let the light define him. He watched the shard disappear, feeling a wave of peace settle over him. The mirror's grip was finally gone, its whispers fading like echoes in the distance. He was free of Malvern Hall, free of the ouroboros that had nearly devoured him, the endless cycle broken. He turned from the window, the memory of the mirror fading to a shadow on the edge of his mind. The road ahead was narrow, winding, but it was his to walk. He had faced the darkness and survived, carrying only the lessons it had left him. Though the scars of Malvern Hall would remain, they no longer defined him. He understood now that he had the power to choose, to shape his future beyond the reach of shadows. He took a deep, steadying breath and stepped out of the room, making his way to the inn's main hall. The warmth of the fire, the murmur of voices, the clinking of cups, all of it welcomed him back to life. And as he walked forward, leaving the darkness of Malvern Hall behind, he knew he was finally, truly free. Text and graphics were generated with the assistance of ChatGPT. Audio content was produced using tools from 11 Labs and Udio.